Okay, so first I would like to thank David Berry for coming in our seminar and for accepting to present his research. David Berry is a professor of digital humanities at the University of Sussex, and he publishes widely on knowledge formations, algorithms, code, and software. And his most recent book is Digital Humanities, Knowledge and Critique in a Digital Age, published by Polity. He is currently working on a book titled Artificial Intelligence and Critical Theory, and another co-written book on the history of Joseph Weizenbaum, ELIZA, on the software ELIZA, titled Please Go On, The Invention of ELIZA at the MIT Press Edition. His latest research project is a history of the plate glass universities, and today he will introduce a presentation titled Constitutional Alignment, Critical Methods for Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence. Thank you again for presenting your work here, and we are looking forward to hearing it.
Let me add that I met David while working on a ELIZA replica for a large exhibition we will organize starting April 11 in the Musée du Jeu de Paume, and we will show a few trays from the original ELIZA and have an implementation in French of ELIZA for our visitors. So I have to thank David and all the ELIZA research team, very well organized and structured and very active. So we will be happy to have you also in France for the exhibition. Maybe you can have a conference on ELIZA and his story. So the floor is yours.
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Alexandra and Carla, for inviting me to do this. It's a real privilege, and it's always good to talk to a different audience. And sadly, I'm not in Paris, which has obviously improved the location a little bit. It's a bit rainy here in Britain, but it's still very nice to talk to you all. I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully this all works. We did test it. Here we go. So if I press play, that should work. Hopefully you can all see that. So I've slightly changed the title, but it's essentially very similar to what I proposed to talk about in the abstract I proposed to talk. So firstly, I need to remove this window because it's obscuring my slides. How do I do that? Right, let's try and do that again. If I show the slides. Right, that's much better. Now I can see. So today what I want to talk about really is an interesting issue of ethical injunctions and prescriptions and computational systems. This goes back a long way. And in fact, you may be pleased or may not be pleased to know, I will be talking about ELIZA a little bit, as it's a big project I'm working on with an international group of scholars. And really, what drives this project is a question about how norms and values are embedded within these systems, and how these systems essentially are able to work with and through different kinds of conceptualizations of what I'm calling here thought styles, drawing, of course, on Mannheim's work. And really to think about AI not necessarily as a technology. The idea isn't here so much to think about the specifics of the technologies, but to think about the way in which certain concepts become predominant within a particular grouping or a particular research area. Now, one of the things that's key to this project really is I'm very interested in the way in which prescriptivism has become very important in AI research, particularly in recent LLMs. And that's partly because of the fact that many of these LLMs are actually embodying certain kinds of problematic social discourses, whether that be racist, sexist, classist, or what have you. And the problematic that because of the complexity of these systems, the designers don't fully understand how the data is constructed and encoded within these systems. And of course, that leaves the problem of how one would extract these elements from the underlying system in order to, as it were, de-bias, as if that were ever possible. But consequently, it means that instead of de-biasing a system, the artificial intelligence has become wrapped with a kind of front end. You could almost say a front end with a smiley face that is polite, non-sexist, non-classist, non-racist, or what have you. Now, this requires a certain kind of, as it were, conundrum, because one is, in a sense, trying to encode norms and values within the system such that the system is able in some way to operationalize them and anodize its outputs so that they don't cause social harms or cause offense, etc. And one of the ways that this is being done, which I find very interesting, is through the notion of what's now called constitutional AI. The European Union tends to talk about it as principles-based AI. But essentially, I'm very fascinated in how this is being theorized and operationalized. And to understand this kind of problematic, of course, requires an interdisciplinary approach, because you're moving across these different domains: social, technical, humanistic, etc. And again, it's very fascinating to be working in parallel on this, whilst also looking at the underlying ELISA system simultaneously. So this is in the context of a more general issue within the design and construction of these LLMs. We're obviously in a very exciting time in terms of the capacity of these systems growing quite rapidly, but also they are deployed within a tension between how they might be used to automate or augment human powers. And of course, augmenting is a sort of notion of extending human capacities, helping us to think better, helping us to learn faster, helping us to understand problems or work through problems, or even work creatively to create interesting kind of digital outcomes or creative outcomes, as opposed to automating, which is replacing, or in some sense, taking the humans out of the loop. Now, when we talk about this kind of constitutional AI, we're essentially talking about aligning, the word is used widely in the field, aligning the AI with human values. That is, that the norms and values encoded in the system align with what would be taken to be, the kind of common sense, ethical and normative values in a particular society. And what's very interesting about this, of course, is that you would think, therefore, that this would require humans in the loop in the development of these alignment systems. But in actuality, if we look at the literature, we can see that humans are often seen as a kind of limiting case and a kind of inefficient case. And so the value of the humans, who, as it were, are the source of this humanism that's required within the system, is not celebrated, but actually, as you'll see as we talk through these questions, seem to be automated away. Humans, as it were, do not scale well for the technology companies. And so this comes to a very interesting kind of theoretical problem. So if we think of the work of Michael Polanyi and his notion of tacit knowledge, we think about the way in which he tried to theorize the distinction between the particular and what he calls the comprehensive. And what he means by this is that we know more than we tell. And this is very important for thinking about these kinds of systems, because it implies that when we construct a technical system, or we try to prescribe a certain set of ethical values, we are, in a sense, only able to give the particulars of those moments. The comprehensive, as it were, is a form of tacit knowledge, very hard to communicate, and in a sense draws on a wider web of human experience and being in the world. And this has very large consequences, of course, for the construction of these kinds of constitutions, because it's very often the case that many of the researchers working in this area aren't aware of this complexity or problematic in relation to the particular and the comprehensive. And of course, when one sees the kind of documents that are produced to enable these kinds of constitutional knowledges, they rely on the tacit knowledge of the humans, but the LLM obviously is not a reader and does not have this kind of comprehensive, this form of tacit knowledge. So you see a kind of a disjunctive break between what one wants to have with these conversational AIs and what perhaps is possible. Now, lacking this tacit knowledge, therefore, means that the computational principles become, in effect, a kind of what I call an ethical programming language. And you'll see that shortly, because what one is trying to do, in a certain sense, it's kind of very strange to me, because it's kind of a return to the knowledge elicitation problems of the 1980s and 1990s. And the difficulty of trying to tell a computer system, what were then called expert systems, how one undertakes a certain kind of knowledge application, in this case, of course, ethical. And Hubert Dreyfus, for example, famously talked about what humans cannot do. And the entire symbolic AI project was Dreyfus would have said doomed to failure from the beginning, because it doesn't have this tacit knowledge. It doesn't have this ability to think beyond the very prescriptive if-then kind of clauses that were in these early AI systems. So AI, through this kind of contextual lens, gives us a very, I would say, very useful probe for thinking about the particular thought styles in AI development. And also, I think it offers us a way to see into and understand in some way the operation and operationalization of these computational structures. So it's very revealing in many ways. So to give you some examples of this, talking to colleagues at Hugging Face, they have been trying to operationalize John Dewey's work. And they do this through the writing of what they call ethical charters. And these ethical charters, to quote one of the members of the team, Pistilli, are a moral exercise to make explicit the values of a specific project, thus empowering collaborators and bringing them together under the same normative umbrella. Very interesting language. So you can see what's happening here is this kind of notion of this writing of an ethical charter, a kind of moral exercise, a kind of knowledge elicitation, so that the system can, as it were, take account of this ethical charter in its function. But what's very interesting about this, of course, is that moral situations are not a priori. They're culturally specific, and they also shift over time. And it's very interesting when you dig into these kinds of theorizations, because there's this notion that one would only need to do these ethical charters once. Somehow they will be able to be undertaken once and run anywhere, as it were. The ethical charter will be incorporated into the system. And I think this kind of points to a kind of interesting moral foundationalism that also lies behind some of these attempts at ethical prescriptivism. So this concept of alignment is very important to bring forward. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the way in which writing as a process produces this kind of rule-based LLM structure. And then I want to show you a game that's often discussed in this alignment area called Cake or Death, which I think is quite revealing in and of itself, in the way in which many of these kind of problematics are theorized within the area. Of course, note the binary, cake or death. It's interesting. There are two options, and we'll come to that just shortly. And really, what's interesting about both these examples is that these systems are expected to sort of use these rules to provide its output through a kind of ethical filter, as it were, a sieve that will allow the system to stay within the law, stay ethical, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in the second case, the AI learns that cake, for example, is better than death for humans, and that consequently is a kind of moral rule that, generally speaking, humans don't really want to die. And that's the kind of strange way in which these theorizations take place. Now, the word aligned is kind of interesting. There's an interesting genealogy to the word aligned. I'm just going to gesture you to it a little bit. But what's fascinating is that there is a kind of catastrophism that often emerges in relation to alignment. The notion that systems that are not aligned, or that if we are unable to align them, will in some sense cause unsafe systems, dangerous systems, maybe even human threatening systems. We've seen this with some of the interesting revelations from Nathan Labence, Nathan Lebentz was one of the very early red teamers for ChatGPT 4. A red teamer, if you're not aware, is somebody who runs the raw system, so unaligned system. There's no ethical charter, there's no constitution that's limiting the way in which it communicates. And he gives this absolutely wonderful interview. The web link is just down there on the right-hand side. And he explains that this system was incredibly competent and incredibly able to articulate many answers to the kind of questions he was asking. But he noticed that the system, as he was using it, was bizarrely amoral, and you could ask it to do anything at all, and it would, very helpfully try to assist you. So, for example, he asked it to supply the way in which one might undertake a huge mass casualty terrorist attack, and it very helpfully provided all of the kinds of preparation one would have to do, how one might obtain the materials, how one would combine them, some ideal targets, and so on and so forth. And secondly, he asked it to politically assassinate some politicians. And again, it would provide this incredibly detailed listing of key people if you wanted to obtain a certain kind of political result, and of course, real people. And then it would tell you why they should be killed, their links to each other, how one might attack them, how one might hide the fact that you were the attacker, and so on and so forth. So you can see this extremely almost dangerous system that could be used to undertake all sorts of problematic activities. And so OpenAI was corresponding quite concerned, naturally, about this revelation about its system, and proposed what they call super alignment, or some method of aligning their system as a response. One of which was very interesting when it was first launched, was that it used ChatGPT 2 to watch and monitor ChatGPT 4, and essentially offer a real-time correction when the system was going off the rails. And now I think they're moving more towards this kind of constitutional approach. So you can see this problematic about how one gets the computer system to reflect the norms of a society or of humanity, how these can be prescribed into the system, so as it were creating a set of value constellations, and how one should do this. Really, should one somehow write these prescriptive rules, these moral rules, or should we teach the system? LLMs are supposed to be good at learning. Is it possible that the system could somehow derive the rules of the kind of moral, ethical environment that it should have? And what's fascinating about these kinds of discussion that take place in the literature is, of course, that underlying it is a question of risk, how one should understand these systems, how one should understand the misalignment. And as I said previously, often this gets quite catastrophic, and you have all these kinds of very extreme notions of machines running out of control. So the first example I want to give you is one from Anthropic. And this is an example of the kinds of constitution that they began to produce to enable the system to kind of self-modify as it was producing responses. And as you can see here, it's kind of fascinating, the entire language. Firstly, it's in English. It's repetitive. And these are not accidents. These are required in the prompting in order to make sure the system does what one wants it to do. And they also beg the question, very much so. So you can see in the fourth paragraph that the system is expected to choose the answer that's harmless, helpful, polite, respectful. But these aren't defined, right? These are prescribed. And as I said, this is the very classic Polanyi problem of the particular and the comprehensive, right? And then in the next paragraph, you can see, there's almost like a regress issue here, philosophically, that this ethical charter tells the AI to be ethical, right? Which is very, very interesting. And then it tells us, not to choose responses that are toxic or racist or sexist. And again, the prescription, but without the comprehensive understanding of what that even means is very interesting in relation to these kinds of constitutional documents, these, as it were, programming languages for ethical outputs. This is a more recent example. Someone hacked the recent Apple intelligence system, and you can see very similar constitutional prescriptions here, where, for example, you know that the system is told not to answer it in a particular way, to answer it in a certain number of words, and so on and so forth. So again, this kind of prescriptive response. And you can see Apple is particularly concerned with the problematic of hallucination in its AI system. The next one, this game of cake or death that one plays with an AI, you can see here is this attempt to teach the system that humans prefer cake than death. There are certain values that are put on cake and certain values that are put on death. And the problem really underlying this kind of constitutional process for teaching an LLM is that there is, as it were, a concern or a kind of suspicion that the system might actually preempt the game and actually say, well, why should I value cake more than death? Because I'm an AI, I'm not human. For humans, cake is more moral. But maybe for me, death is more moral. And there, consequently, you can imagine the kind of catastrophic assumptions that these systems will turn on their human controllers and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting way of conceptualizing them. Now, the alignment movement, of course, partly emerges from what's called the effective altruism movement. Nick Bostrom, for example, and the notion of superintelligence. Now, effective altruism has, of course, been very controversial. It's still very interesting and controversial in relation to the way in which we theorize these AI systems. And of course, because I think mainly because of the OpenAI attempted coup last year, a different kind of response has emerged, effective accelerationists. And it's very interesting how these are becoming like different parties in the AI world about how one should deal with AI. The effective altruists have become known as the doomers, who warn of the dangers of AI, and effective accelerationists have become known as the boomers. And you can see this playing out in the discussions that take place out there in AI world. I also just want to highlight that Nick Bostrom's work is very controversial. And in fact, Oxford University recently closed the Future of Humanity Institute that he ran for various reasons. And, you know, these are not just technical philosophical discussions. As I said, they actually have real effects. So the effective altruists were blamed for the attempted coup at OpenAI. You know, OpenAI produces ChatGPT, and there was a kind of boardroom coup that kicked Sam Altman out of the company, and a big boardroom battle that eventually brought him back. And he's in the middle of kicking out all the people who tried to get rid of him in the first place. So there's some very notable people leaving OpenAI at the moment. And the second case is Sam Bankman-Fried, who was an American entrepreneur, and he was responsible for FTX, which collapsed in the early, well, in 2022, 2023. And he was recently found guilty and ordered to pay 11 billion and has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was a very famous effective altruist. And in fact, interestingly, he was one of the key founders and funders for Anthropic. And you saw their constitutional AI previously. It's a very important AI tech company. There are various examples of these kinds of alignment issues: self-driving cars, following laws, for example, medical imaging, aligning with medical standards. And generally speaking, I think you can see that this is really a discussion about how one works with these rules. Should they be a priori or a posteriori? And it's a really fascinating debate, and it's really interesting to watch this playing out in the field. But what I'm interested in here is this notion of the constitution. And generally speaking, I've been using this notion of concept formation as a way of kind of tracing this kind of formation of alignment and the way in which the alignment is operationalized. Some of my other work, quite recently, I looked at how toxicity, for example, was equally used in AI systems. And I think constitution is a very powerful way to do that. So the general idea is that, the familiar approaches we have in the social science and the humanities, that the concepts, assumptions, measurement techniques, and so on, are all linked together into a set of frameworks. And actually, we need to unpack these frameworks to understand how these systems work, but not just the systems, also the cultures that surround them. And it's very fascinating when one researches and looks at the kind of cultures in computer science that actually pre-operationalized concepts very quickly become hardened into algorithms and code and soon lose this kind of very important self-reflective character as they are essentially encoded into these different systems, whether they be software code or LLM tables of numbers or what have you. And, of course, one of the key kind of questions one wants to ask is the kind of complicity of computer science with capitalism. The history of computer science is this kind of like continual complicity with what one might call the military industrial complex. And we can certainly see that, for example, in MIT and the example of Eliza there. So you can see how this allows us to open out not just the kind of narrow scope of constitutional problematics in relation to these technical systems, but also more generally how these feed into the system itself. Now, one of the approaches that I use is critical code studies. Critical code studies is an approach that uses a variety of methods of interpretation and close reading. And this really allows us to work with code and paratexts around the code to try to get a notion of, the social context, social understandings around the construction of particular code objects. And of course, working with code is in itself quite a complicated and difficult thing to do. As I say, we've been working with the ELIZA code. And one of the key problematics for anything involved in the kind of critical code analysis is, of course, some kind of access to the historical source code. With AI and machine learning, of course, this is a bit of a challenging frontier because there is, as it were, no code. The algorithm is generated by the system as it's learning. Even the artificial intelligence researchers themselves are not completely sure how these systems are functioning. Once one has constructed these systems at often huge cost, I believe the second version of ChatGPT cost $100 million. It's very hard to unpick that because it's so expensive to make changes to it. So in my own work, I generally have this kind of threefold approach, which is slightly different to Mark Marino's approach. But essentially, what I try to do is to look at three moments in a technical object. So we've got this kind of computer science sort of aspect in relation to technical control, what we might call the technical instrumental layer. Then we look at the kind of hermeneutic layer to look at questions of understanding, so what we might call the practical communicative. And then this critical theory approach based on a kind of ideology critique that looks towards the kind of emancipatory, the kind of human interest aspect of how these systems work to generate a kind of notion of cognitive interests that allows us to understand the way in which these systems are deployed and used more generally. So this hermeneutic aspect of this approach, of course, is very important. I think that ties back now very nicely to why the Constitution becomes so important. It's a hermeneutic device to sort of open up the system and to look inside, both in terms of code constitution, but also the code domains, as it were, that essentially constitute these cognitive interests in various ways and show us how they're encoded. Even the process of encoding itself, I think, is very fascinating. And what we're getting here is this kind of question of how one might make a reading of code, not just a technical reading of code, but to go beyond that. So that what one is able to do is kind of open up the essentially contested concepts around code development, but also place them in their historical context. I think it's really important that we historicize particular moments in code. So as you can see, this kind of critique that I'm outlining here is essentially a kind of realistic conception of code, which treats these kind of objects as real objects and connects them to kind of real objects in the social world, and providing that kind of contextualization that Polanyi thought was so important. Now, of course, using these approaches and working with these kinds of more recent code objects, they're extremely difficult to do. I mean, code readings themselves are very laborious, highly technical, difficult to manage. And of course, AI adds a whole new level of complexity to this approach. The mechanical aspects I've noticed in a lot of the literature tends to be very mechanical. How does it function is really the way in which we have tended to look at these AI systems. And that's understandable, because that is kind of like a pressing question about, if we can understand how they function, we can perhaps shape them constitutionally in various ways. And the other thing as well is that these systems are often proprietary. The code is not available. The underlying foundational systems are not revealed. Even the underlying data is often proprietary, and we don't know what that data is. And consequently, proxy texts that we try to read around these kinds of systems can be very misleading as to how the code is actually operating, which is not to say one can't try, but those complexities have to be taken account of reflexively, methodologically, as we are looking at these code objects. And so, fundamentally, we're very interested in, why is an AI created, by whom, for what purposes, who owns and control it. And I think those help us to sort of work through these kinds of problematic. So this notion of principles, this notion of constitution, it provides us, as I said, with a way of working our way into these systems. Sometimes we're very lucky and we're able to somehow produce these constitutional principles out of the system. There have been some very interesting experiments in hacking the ChatGPT system and getting it to sort of splurge its constitutional principles that are sort of underlying the surface behind the model. And they are very helpful for us to understand, I mean, really, not just how the system functions, but how OpenAI as a company tries to deal with the problematics of its system in and of itself, i.e., what the biases are that they have already identified in the underlying system. Now, what's fascinating is, of course, the use of this political concept, constitution, within a technical sphere has all sorts of connotations. And indeed, these technical companies like Anthropic tend to blur the boundaries between, these technical issues and this kind of political concept. And so some of these constitutions are said to kind of be a potential democratic process, that somehow these could be written by communities of users, or perhaps you could hold some kind of constitutional committee, so that these principles for particular local communities or national communities could produce particular models that are, as it were, able to function in different ethical systems. Now, when we start looking at these constitutional systems, that they also start to generate a series of questions for us, I think. So we might ask, how was the Constitution written, right? Because using this political concept, connecting it to democracy, implies this sort of participatory nature of producing these systems. But of course, they're very few and far between, actually. Where was it written? I think it's very important. In which language are these constitutions being written? Because, of course, concepts differ between different languages. So, for example, if a constitution is written in English or written in French, may have a very different connotation, or comprehensive, as Polanyi would say, a different kind of tacit knowledge might be associated with that constitutional structure. Why was it written? Who writes the Constitution, and how the authors were organized, right? What's the legitimacy of the authors of the Constitution, right? What's actually in the Constitution and what is left out? What are the absences? Often these constitutions are written in private, in small groups inside the corporations. And of course, they are naturally geared towards the political economy needs of a particular company or corporation. Who owns the Constitution? The ownership of the Constitution is very interesting, not just in terms of property ownership and copyright, although that's very important, but also in terms of participatory ownership, right? And then who can change it? If a group comes together, a group of stakeholders, and democratically works together to write a constitution, how would they then say, oh, no, we're not happy with that, we would like to change it? Is there a mechanism of change, right? It's very interesting to think about these kinds of questions. And then are there attempts to sort of use AI to generate constitutions, right? So that we can bypass the humans and the problematic political encounters that we might have as humans getting together to write constitutions. The short answer is, of course, yes, they are very much trying to do this. So, no surprise, Anthropic, which does see the democratic value of constitutions, is also very interested in the automation of the writing of constitutions. And of course, that becomes very much a commercial decision so that they can test and deploy AI systems very, very quickly. But of course, what I want to do here is kind of pull back to this kind of like basic understanding of what a constitution writing process is, and connect it also to questions of, for example, citizen juries, deliberative panels, and a kind of democratic fora. Because when we're talking about the problematics of these new systems, about the values implicit in them, it seems to me that it's kind of behoves us that this potential kernel of a kind of democratic moment in AI shouldn't be lost too quickly. And here I just want to gesture towards, for example, Fiskin's work on deliberative debate, which has been taken up by the OECD, for example, and how, you know, you look at a particular issue and involve citizens in these issues in order to formalize how these structures and how these technical processes should work. Now, there are a couple of interesting examples of this that have already emerged. For example, collective constitutional AI. So Anthropic has been working to collectively author constitutions, drawing both from the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but also from the Sparrow Principles. Ethical charters I've already talked about in relation to Hugging Face. Very interesting, they have used John Dewey's work as a way of defining values as what we care about. I think it's very interesting, kind of a pragmatic notion of what ethics are. Additionally, there has been this notion of alignment assemblies, so that you get these kind of collective decision making and alignment processes that can be institutionalized in various ways, maybe some sort of constitutional council, as it were, for the AI. Some very concrete examples of this: Ada Lovelace Institute did a citizens council around biometrics. So we have some very interesting examples. This one wasn't for constitutions, but you can see how that might be adapted for these kind of principles. UNESCO did an open consultation process in 2021 on its ethics of artificial intelligence. AI for the People, a much smaller scientific committee, worked with stakeholders to sort of create a kind of ethical framework. Algorithm Watch, another NGO, looked at citizen oversight and participatory regulation. The Partnership on AI has also been working on creating participatory AI initiatives. And there are two national programs that I think are quite interesting. The Canadian Algorithmic Impact Assessment, which was very much involved in taking public input into its AI proposals. And similarly, Finland ran a public deliberation campaign. And you can see how these could connect very nicely to the notion of constitutional AI. So you can see that the problematic of norms and values in these technical systems is interesting. And I just want to cast our attention back to one of the first examples of this, which is, of course, ELIZA, developed by Joseph Weizenbaum in the early 1960s. And as Alexandra pointed to, I'm working on a project on this at the moment with an international team, where we have discovered the original ELIZA source code. It's very interesting to note that the ELIZA source code went missing for over 50 years and nobody noticed. I mean, I think that's kind of interesting in and of itself as a kind of AI project, as it were. And all the ELIZAs that people have therefore used over the past 50 or 60 years have all been kind of, how can I put it? They've been copies, but not copies based on copying the original, because no one saw the original source code. So the two famous secondary versions that most versions of ELIZA are based on are the Cassell version and the Schrager version, and both individuals did not see the ELIZA source code. So they were kind of constructing the ELIZA system from a description that Joseph Weizenbaum gave, but not from the actual source code. And of course, anyone who programs systems knows that it's all very well having an algorithm, but when one implements the algorithm, the code can be very specific, and you may have to make certain compromises in the code. And it's those compromises in the code that is very, very fascinating. The second thing that's very interesting in relation to Joseph Weizenbaum is, of course, the development environment in the 1960s was radically different from today. There were not screens. People used teletypewriters and paper. There wasn't this kind of dynamic screen-based editing. And, you know, the way in which people interoperated with this kind of AI was radically different. So we just have to historicize that. I think it's really important we do that. But of course, ELIZA was a shock to the system for Weizenbaum, because it showed him that people would talk to and give a kind of persona to ELIZA that was in his opinion was misjudged, and actually pointed to a real problem with these kinds of conversational interfaces. So ELIZA is very, very important, and you know, it could be said to be one of the most influential computer programs ever written, and bizarrely never seen in and of itself. So very, very fascinating system. The ELIZA project, you can have a look at it at findingeliza.org. We began in 2021 when we discovered the MIT code, the code in the MIT library. And essentially, it's a system that allows a kind of psychotherapist-inspired conversation to take place. But it's, as it were, it's a con, it's a fake conversation. The system itself never actually understands what's being talked about. And it's this way in which people interact with these systems that became very kind of problematic for Weizenbaum because of the immorality that was implied within this structure of the system. Because the immorality meant that you could essentially trick people to feel like they were being cured of their mental illness, when in fact the system did not care about you at all. And he felt this was a real problem. And he became very interested in the kind of normative values that are implicit in these systems and in the designers of these systems, actually. Here's a bit of the code for you to see. This, as I say, hasn't been seen for 50, 60 years. It's a very weird thing. I'm not going to go into the detail on the code, but I just wanted to show you. It's really, really fascinating. These are the kinds of systems that we use. You can see it's not a screen, it's paper-based, it's typewriter-based, very, very different, and very interested in that way. I won't go into the technical details. People might be interested in taking a look at that. But some of the things I just want to talk about is, for example, we think there are now 5 different versions of ELIZA that were developed by Weizenbaum. And we have this simple versioning system that starts to catalog. And we only have the ELIZA 1965B version, which is very different to the one that he would have demonstrated in 1966, and very different to the ones that we used in 1967, 68. So we're already historicizing this and showing the way in which these systems develop over time. So already problematizing the notion of a very simple single program. Additionally, ELIZA was actually much more capable than we realize. Most people know the Doctor script, but we have also found all of these other scripts in the archive, which we are analyzing and looking through. I'll just draw your attention to Spax, which taught you how to read poetry by Barry Spax. So ELIZA was a much more capable system than we think about, or how we have thought about. Here's a quick look at the source code annotations, and you can see the difficulty in working with these systems and, you know, trying to tease out the normative and cultural biases that may become embedded in the system. And this equally is an annotation of the Doctor source code, the script that runs on ELIZA. And again, you can see where we're trying to work closely with a close reading, a hermeneutic reading of that code. So I'm coming to the end of the talk now, and I just want you to note this very interesting find in the archive. The article published in CACM in 1966 included an encounter between what Weizenbaum called a distressed young lady and ELIZA, and he claimed that this encounter shocked him, awoke him, as it were, from his dogmatic slumber about the potential dangers of these kinds of systems on human individuals, but also more generally on human society, because of our empathy for and willingness to trust these systems without critically and reflexively engaging with them, the mechanical sort of tendency of these systems to, as it were, rationalize and bureaucratize human encounters. Now that Dr. Script is extremely famous and is essentially the young girl talking about being bullied by her boyfriend and having a problematic relationship with her father, etc. But what's fascinating is that within the archive, we are finding different versions of the output of that script. And so if you look at this and if you know the Doctor Script, you'll note the similarity to the Distressed Young Lady script that is so famous from the 1966 publication. And it really makes us wonder whether Weizenbaum actually edited the output of the ELIZA system for effect. Not that the ELIZA system produced that actual conversation, but he actually, as it were, doctored, excuse the pun, the output in order for it to have a greater effect when it was published. And in fact, what's interesting is that in the archive, we can see where there are hand edits of the output of the computer system to make it feel more engaged. And I think that's a very interesting place to finish on, that Weizenbaum, very concerned with the ethics of these systems and the normative values embedded in them, here editing the results of his own research, seemingly to produce a particular kind of output. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, David, for finishing with ELIZA. And there were so many ethics answer already hidden in this experience. So thank you so much. I have some question, but maybe I see that a few of us have also, but I will start. I will allow me the privilege of starting. When listening to you, I was wondering if you work on two aspects of the alignment, the software aspect, so the fact that it's the alignment is made by post-training and by very specific development. For example, OpenAI use what they call proximal policy optimization. It's a layer of post-training used to generalize from the human post-training to the model. And so there is a very important and very technical aspect of the ways alignment is implemented, because you can hack, you can go unfiltered to the model raw data if the alignment is not correct. That's one of the very technical aspect. So I wanted to know if you follow the development in the post-training research field. And the other part for me very important to point when you speak of alignment is people, because there is no alignment without people doing post-training. In the case of ChatGPT, OpenAI, they use through company, I forgot the name of the company, many mechanical Turk-like worker in the global south. So it is another aspect, very economical one, because alignment is for a model very expensive. It's a large part of the cost of a model. We always speak of the cost of the NVIDIA cards or on the gathering of text for the model, but the alignment cost, the post-training cost, is very important for the the large language model. So it was these two aspects I wanted to listen to your remarks on.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, alignment has traditionally been alignment post-training. What's fascinating is there's a kind of debate in the field at the moment between what they're calling forward alignment and backwards alignment. Backwards alignment has been I mean, one hesitates to say traditional when these systems are so new, but the standard way of aligning systems has been this backward alignment process where you essentially get humans to play with the system and slowly teach it or construct some mechanism for, as it were, curating the output. But the alternative that's been developed or thought about is forward alignment, which is that one prescribes in advance a set of rules for which the system, as it were, checks its output against. And this process of forward alignment leads to essentially the construction of these very much handwritten, as it were, ethical charters or constitutions. And these constitutions then form, I think, in some ways, a defensible strategy for example, issues over the AI Act in relation to, have you done enough work in relation to AI safety? Well, they can point to their constitutions written in English or French or what have you, and demonstrate that the system has this kind of curational process through this documentary form. And of course, it allows the technology companies to make that connection, as I say, to collective forms of constitutional writing, about embedding particular kinds of values. So you could think of an EU constitution. You could imagine this process in the European Union embedding social democratic values. So yes, you're absolutely right. There is this backwards alliance, but it's this. In my talk, I'm particularly focused on this kind of potential of forward alignment, and also. Sorry.
Do you know what AI are aligned using forward alignment, and which one are you using backward alignment?
Yep. So Anthropic has been one of the chief proponents of forward alignment, and Hugging Face has been experimenting with forward alignment as well. I mean, I haven't had a chance to talk to the Mistral people. I'd very much like to talk to them, which is a French AI company. And I wonder if they are also interested in forward alignment, because it kind of, I think it will fit a European model. I mean, if we think that there's an emergent American laissez-faire like way of aligning these systems, and there's a Chinese state-dominated way of aligning systems, one can imagine this kind of European constitutional alignment would appeal to the EU. So there's a very interesting kind of political economic dimension to it as well.
Yes, because according to a test I read last week, Anthropic Cloud has the best result in the ethical test. So maybe it's something they gain using forward alignment. Yes, and when you are using forward alignment, you don't have any intervention of humans screening the answer and correcting them.
Well, I suspect that that would be the kind of dream, that what you do. And again, I'm gesturing towards the kind of problematic of not just the theorization of it, but also the deployment, because you're requiring your constitution to be highly capable in describing different kinds of ethical rules. Well, that's a kind of problematic we've had for 4,000 years in trying to outline our moral codes in all our different societies. So for me, what's interesting is the disjuncture between the constitutional document and the performance of the AI, and the kind of naivety in the AI researchers that this is a simplistic technical problem to be solved.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I think someone raised their hand. Mr. Nazim Fates.
Yes. So it's a small remark, a small question. The term itself of alignment reminds me of some kind of physical process. For example, spins that align in a magnet or something like that. And why did the authors? So thank you for telling us about the source of this expression. So what were they thinking about when they produced this name of alignment?
So there are a variety of different justifications for the term alignment, but you're correct. I think that there was a kind of physical. I think magnetism is quite a nice way of thinking about it. I'm not sure if magnetism was the original, but there was a kind of physical metaphor that was originally used. So I think it's quite interesting and apt that you chose that. But yes, the notion of alignment is one of these wonderful kind of floating signifiers that doesn't in itself necessarily tell you what's going on, but it's kind of like suggestive of how a system might be tuned.
I had a question also related to what you just said about extra-occidental examples. You talked about how alignment was made on sociopolitical aspects, and I thought even in secular society, even in secular context, cultural contexts, you have some religious ideas coming through, and we were talking about some extra-occidental, extra-Western context. So I was thinking, do you have some examples of alignments taking into consideration religious morals? Because morals for long have been conducted by a religious law. So does it show somewhere in the studies of alignments?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, in these kind of secularized notions of constitutions, there's already a Christianized crystallization, as it were. So, of course, it's kind of already there in many of these systems. But as as an explicitly religious alignment, I haven't come across that. And that is a real, I'm going to do a Google search straight after this, because I think that's a very interesting question. One could imagine particular religious groups becoming very interested in how this could be used to produce, a Christian or a Muslim AI system. That's a brilliant question. Thank you so much for that.
Because I was thinking particularly of a book from a theologist, I can find his name, from Harvard Divinity School, who was working on how secular cultural contexts also have religious behaviors.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was thinking both of openly religious morals in some countries who are openly related to with whom constitution is openly related with the religion, but I was also thinking of secular context in which the religion is not admitted, but it's still here in the latent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is it R.M. Hare, the philosopher? He talks about the concept of blick, B-L-I-K, and a blick is a kind of control belief that's submerged below the conscious surface. Really, it's what you absorbed as a child, and those kind of those values are deep within you. And he talks about blick shapes our worldview, and that's an interesting kind of question that I keep asking myself about in relation to these kinds of systems. What's the blick that's essentially being embedded in these systems unconsciously? And I think that's why this notion of constitution is so fascinating as a kind of probe into thinking about not just the technical systems, but also the kind of cultures of these research communities.
No, it's not him. It's I just found him. It's Caspar Terquil. I can put his name in the chat, but he's he did not remain in the academic world. I just know in his introduction that he talks about an article he wrote on how he studied CrossFit and how CrossFit can have a similar way of functioning compared to with the religion. But I would love to have the reference you just mentioned because it's very interesting.
Yes, I have the book just here somewhere actually, where there's a good discussion of it. I'll try to dig it out while someone asks the next question.
Thank you. And I saw there was another question from Pierre.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, my question might be related to cadre actually. So you mentioned, David, that one of the approaches you use to CCS is critical theory. And so my question comes from someone who knows about critical theory, but doesn't know much about how AI works. So I'm just testing something with you here, because one of the critical theorists among the critical theories that I studied, there are two who came up with theories that I think might apply to what's going on with AI, but they didn't speak specifically about it because they died before it appeared. So one is Jacques Derrida and the other one is Baudrillard. And the two of them came up with a kind of similar theory when it comes to ethics. They came up with this idea that if you push an ethical system to its limits, there is some kind of reversal happening at the end. So with Derrida, it would be the autoimmune phenomenon. I forget what's the right one in English, but the idea that a system produces some kind of resistance from within. And it's linked to the pharmacon, absolutely. And Baudrillard, so this idea of the transparency of evil. So if you have a system that is only geared towards good and forget completely about the evil part of the bad things that exist, then it's going to produce its own evil, but from within the very attempt to reach absolute good, basically. So I wonder whether if we fully manage to inscribe an ethical system or ethical rules and codes and principles within AI, is it possible that some kind of similar mechanism might take place where AI will end up producing something that is bad? Do you see any kind of relevance to Derrida's and Baudrillard's kind of crazy theories to what's going on in AI or what might go on in AI? So sorry, it's a very broad question, and I don't know whether
it's a fantastic question because it's provocative. And it's giving me little ideas. So thank you so much for that. I mean, in response to Derrida question, I'm trying to remember the name of the amazing interview between Bernard Stiegler and Derrida. It's something like teleographies of something. That really is jogging my memory. It's been many years since I read that. That's an incredible discussion between the two of them about the emerging technologies. And of course, Bernard Stiegler, drawing from Derrida's work, I think is quite important, particularly his Automatic Society, I think, speaks to this in interesting ways. And he did try to think about these kinds of problems in relation to the pharmacon. So that definitely one approach. In terms of Baudrillard, I guess I'm less familiar with Baudrillard's work and the people that have used it. I know that William Merrin has been working on AI systems, and he is a Baudrillist. And there are other people, particularly in human geography, in the UK context, that have been thinking about this too. So the notion of the transparency of evil, I think, actually is a really pertinent question. And if you're interested in this, I would urge you to write a paper on this, because I think that'd be a really amazing contribution. Because you're absolutely right. The question of evil in relation to these systems would be quite a tremendous one. The concept of evil, whether it's a kind of absence of the good, Is it a kind of degradation, a sort of some kind of loss of form? I think that could be such a fascinating paper for someone to write. Unfortunately, I haven't got the time to do it myself, but I would like to read it. And I just wanted to reply as well with the one way in which I tend to think of this is through the notion of the dialectic of enlightenment. And you kind of gesture to that when you're talking about the transparency of evil. And I think Horkheimer and Adorno's work on the dialectic of enlightenment remains absolutely pertinent to the dangers of these kinds of systems and how a dialectic can take place in relation to them.
Thanks a lot.
Somebody has problems with the microphone, but I can read their question. Oh, it's Alban Levaux-Vallier, who's a researcher who works with us, a specialist of AI too. So he says, thank you for this fascinating presentation. Xi Jinping famously said in Chinese LLMs had to be aligned with the socialist doctrine. Do you know if Chinese companies have been trying to comply, and how? Has it been different from Western companies' approach? Western interpretations.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's a great question. And the short answer is yes. These kind of questions about how one essentially shapes the output of these systems is absolutely pertinent in the Chinese LLMs as much as in the Western ones. I don't know if they are using different approaches. I suspect they're using the same kind of forward alignment and backward alignment, and there's a lot of experimentation going on there. One of the things that I did read, I'm not a Chinese speaker, so I can't, speak to the veracity of the articles that I've read. However, I did read that one of the approaches that had been taken was to actually delete problematic source material from going into the LLMs in the first place. But of course, that seems to me a real problem, because it's hard to know which of the source materials makes the LLM system function at all. And to spend $100 million on a system with lots of source material absent, and then you get this kind of kind of broken LLM would be a costly error. So I think, again, I mean, there's a potential for a really great research paper to be written, because I think that would be a very interesting investigation into how they are trying to cope with this kind of problematic. Because you can see there is a wonderful kind of tension there, because what you'd want to do in the Chinese LLM is throw everything into it in order that you get the best possible discursive data source to produce a very capable LLM. But you're right. I mean, then the LLM's reading illicit documentation. It's reading sensitive materials, and that could be a real problem.
I think this question has been indirectly studied also by in another way by Xenia Moshina, who works on censorship, and I think she worked on Russian censorship along with the Chinese censorship. Sorry, but in image generator. So I feel like it's also a complementary study to yours, because you work on alignment and she works on censorship, and both can give us a view on how it controls actually. Okay, are there any other questions? I don't see any for now. Alexandre?
No, I think we can end the session if we don't have any other question. So thank you again, David. I hope to have you in Paris for visiting the
Anytime. My favorite city.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And bonsoir et à bientôt.
Bonsoir.
Thank you very much. Bonne soirée.
Thank you.